Soundologia.
Soundologia. Soundologia.
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the Soundologia podcast, episode number 4. Soundologia is where we have conversations about sound, art, and technology. If you're interested in modern and experimental music, various sounds, unique sound experiments, and different approaches to sound perceptions, this is the place for you. I'm your host, Pedja Kovačević, and I would like to welcome you to the Soundologia platform and our podcast series. Make sure to like the Soundologia page on Facebook and follow us on Instagram to stay up to date with our upcoming guests and events. As Soundologia brings artists who explore the phenomena of sound from a different perspective, I couldn't help but to invite Professor Dr. Jacob Sudol to be one of my first guests of my show. Jacob is one of the leading names in experimental music and a Miami-based artist, but also someone who educates students about a new realm of sound. Good morning, Jacob, or good evening.
Yeah, good evening, or for me, good morning to you. Yes.
So you are now in Taiwan, right?
Yeah, I'm actually at this similar latitude to you, but upside down. So we're on the opposite sides of the world right now.
Jacob, you're a composer, performer, technologist, and associate professor of music technology and composition at Florida International University, and a coordinator in the music technology area. I was thinking of splitting this conversation into two parts where we will speak about the significance of education in using new technologies that allow the creation of sound. In the second part of this episode, we may touch upon some of your works and dig into some of the techniques you use to create them. So Jacob, can you take us back to the beginning and tell us how you discovered your affinity for experimental music making and performing it?
You know, honestly, this is something I've thought about a fair amount, and I don't want to try to construct a narrative post-talk, so I might just point on a few little things that sort of point to little touchstones throughout my life, and, you know, that kind of maybe gives a little bit of an idea of how things developed over the course of time. I'm pretty grateful to my parents because when I grew up, they never played children's music for me. They just listened to music. So I never had like this idea that there was like, this sort of music that is for kids or music for other levels. It was always just music is something that you should be serious about and critical with and listen to because you like it and because you think you can gather something from it and learn from it and enjoy it, So for me, that was always kind of the attitude. It wasn't just like music is just something you do. And there was no sort of level of, how shall I say, sort of denigration to me as a child to just listen to children's music. So there were a number of, songs and things that I listened to as a kid that kind of I really loved. And I think sort of speak to the more affinities for experimental tendencies that came later. I mean, I was really into the Beatles when I was a little kid. And my favorite songs were always my favorite songs were the ones were the weirdest. So, I remember I as a kid, I was just like, I loved I Am the Walrus. And my favorite part about I Am the Walrus was like the tape collages, these like really weird, noisy passages. Or I really enjoyed Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which my parents had on vinyl, a very rare mono copy, which I'm grateful to have myself now. But particularly, A Day in the Life was really something I loved, particularly because there's this passage where, as I now know, they got a number of orchestral musicians and they said, we're going to count to 20 and you go from the lowest note on your instrument to the highest note on your instrument. And that sort of interlude passage was something I loved. Later, in my teenage years, I started playing guitar. I was really interested in the music of Jimi Hendrix and sort of the timbre of the electric guitar. So that was something that really fascinated me. I also, I grew up in the era when we had, personal tape recorders. And so my dad he was doing his PhD at the same time I was growing up in my grade school. And so he bought like this really fancy state-of-the-art Yamaha tape recorder for interviews. And when he wasn't using it, I would covet it, and I would just go and just make weird noises with it. And I would imagine like making music out of water. And I have boxes of tapes that are full of me just making weird sounds as a kid. So I mean, it's very experimental in that sense. Also, when I started playing piano, I'm very fortunate. I started piano, I think, when I was in second or third grade. And the first lesson that I had as a piano lesson was also included an assignment which I had absolutely no idea what to do about, which was to write a piece of music. It was to come back the next week with a composition. And so it was, of course, extremely challenging, but something I really loved. And so I came back the next week, I started working with, and we didn't do the compositions all the time, but I would do it regularly on my own outside of lessons. So, and I look back on this, and the things I would do were really kind of unusual, I think. And I think you can see sort of continuums from what I was doing then to what I'm doing now. For instance, I was very interested in the idea of, when I was like in fourth or fifth grade, playing, just improvising and seeing if I could make a piece of music without a single third. Like, what does music sound like without triads? Because we would learn theory, and it's like, okay, well, what if I get rid of the things that they're teaching us in theory? Or what if I wrote a piece of music that's just repetitive patterns with 3 notes? I came into my teacher, I was really excited. Listen, I made this piece up. It's like 10 minutes long, and it's only 3 notes. She's like, oh, you sound just like Philip Glass. Like, who's Philip Glass? Now I know it. I listened back to Philip Glass later, and I was like, oh, God, I was doing that. So there's been a lot of that sort of throughout my life. And I've had sort of this critical engagement with, sound and various sort of techniques. And, when I was studying piano later, there's a lot of, my teacher regularly gave me, before my college years, she regularly gave me very contemporary pieces of music. So I was very much interested in things that really pushed the boundaries. And when I would every year we did a composition assignment for a couple months in the winter, I believe, if I remember correctly. And so that was, for me, was like the highlight of the year. So I was always like interested in preparing that composition when that came around. But I was doing it outside of that. So it was still something that I really much was interested in. And later, when I became a student, I became much more interested in the formalization and the history of it. And it just sort of, blossomed from there.
You're someone who educates students on how to use new technologies, software, specifically Macs, MSP application, and hardware to build their virtual instruments and create sound. So how important is formal education in learning software?
I'll be fairly broad and not necessarily talk about software or hardware here, just because sometimes I think I'm a little biased because both my parents were actually educators. And so I've always grown up believing in the value of education. In education, sometimes there's this debate between nurture and nature. And my parents were very much of the mind, and I very much myself am very much of the mind that it's nurture more so than nature, at least with humans, that makes a difference. I also believe, learning is one of the most important and rewarding things we have in our lives. So for me as a teacher, part of my goal is to sort of foster this love of learning and for what it's worth, eventually render myself useless so that students no longer need me. They can develop the critical skills to develop, and understand the logic and the knowledge that they need to teach themselves. So I think, this being said, with any subject, one does actually need a sort of help understanding the structures of knowledge or information so that one can reach the point where the formal education is necessarily necessary, in the future. I give a few examples of this, just because I think examples are really demonstrative examples are really useful. One of which is, for many years before I entered college, I was very much interested in studying jazz and jazz piano. I was a pianist. I entered my undergraduate as a classical piano major, and later a composition major as well. But I was very much interested in jazz, and so I would read books, I would listen to things, and I had my piano teachers, God bless them, even though they weren't jazz pianists, would try to help me learn jazz things. But I never really made much progress. I was okay. I was in jazz band. I did well. But one year, the last year that I was in high school, I was like, I need formal education. I need somebody who really knows jazz, has studied jazz piano, and can help me with this. And I began studying jazz piano that year. And within like a month, I became so much better than I ever was beforehand, because I started to see these patterns and these structures that I was blind to. Somebody who has had this skill and the time of studying pedagogy and understood the efficacy of what methods work, it's invaluable to have that sort of experience in terms of formal education, especially when you're dealing with something that's very difficult and very complicated. Music technology is a field that crosses many disciplines: science, computer science, physics, music, um, art, sound studies, is in terms of the field of art. And so you really do need that understanding of the structure to develop these sort of, rudiments that one's mind can use to develop your own skills and your own understanding of what music technology is. So yeah, a long answer, but I think that's really, I think education is very important in general. Yeah.
How old were you when you studied those jazz patterns?
Oh, I think I was 17, 18. So I
Okay.
started. Yeah.
So it was before the time you discovered analog or those digital field and software to use and to create your experimental music.
Well, this was the late 90s, right? So, this was back when you would, to edit a piece of audio, you would have on a computer, you would have to, you'd cut and paste and you'd have to go go to the bathroom or just wait 4 or 5 minutes. So doing it on computers was not really useful. I had studied guitar, or I picked up a guitar. I've never been formally trained on guitar. And this is something I kind of regret. I probably should be, because I'm a horrible guitarist. But I can play just basic country, blues, and various things, stuff that's not too complicated. But I had a 4-track recorder. I had all these pedals, so I was playing with various forms of music technology before software was largely accessible and largely available. So when it came to learning a lot of stuff in relationship to effects and things like that, and multi-tracking, editing, I had a lot of fundamentals because I had hands-on experience working with various sorts of really rudimentary technologies from the time I was, I want to say 14 or 15, actually.
Mm-hmm. So when we are talking about analog versus digital, it's been a massive transition from analog to digital over the last decades, with the vast amounts of plugins that emulate those analog hardware. And you're now talking about the 90s, where you had to wait 10 to 15 minutes to proceed some sound or to copy and paste some file. So can it be compared simply, or is there any complex explanation for that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult. I'll just make a joke first, because why not? And this is something I sometimes say to students. It's a sort of metaphysical joke when you get down to it, honestly. At the lowest quantum level, the level of the quantum fabric, nothing is actually analog or continuous. Transitions are always discrete. You're always just going from one state to another state. I partially say this because I used to believe analog can never be duplicated in a computer. And when I think about the fundamentals of the structure of the universe, well, maybe it actually can. But to be a little less opaque, I don't really think there's an answer to this. It's not something I talk about or think much. I've thought so much about over the years, or discussed as much in terms of a lot of the other subjects I talk about. I remember one of the best discussions I heard about this was a few years ago. I was listening to there was an interview on NPR with Kevin Shields of My Bloody Valentine, and where it was a long interview, mostly talking about the differences between analog versus digital hardwares. And I think that his summary is probably one of the best summaries I've had, that I've heard over the years, which is specifically that digital audio technologies are designed to, as closely as possible, perfectly replicate a sound as is produced or recorded, whereas analog studio techniques each impart a specific sonic colorization or color. So every analog piece of hardware you're going to use is going to impart a color. It's not to say that digital technologies don't do that, especially when we're looking at technologies from the 80s or 90s, the original DX7, I think, had a 10-bit depth. So the fidelity of that is rather poor. I think it's really wrong to say one is better or worse, or that we've necessarily transitioned from one to the other. It's just they're different. What one prefers in one instance is a matter of taste. I'm not going to be, and I'm not going to say, there's another interview I saw once with Niles Klein, where he's saying, I'm not a purist. And I'm not going to say I'm a purist analog, I'm a purist digital. They're just different. This said, the thing is, I really did grow up in the digital age. So I feel that I'm really quite aware of the clear advantages of digital technologies. For instance, just the ability to edit and control audio in the digital realm is so vastly superior to so much of what is afforded in analog technologies. I mean, I mentioned previously the fact that it used to take me 5 to 10 minutes for copying and pasting files. I mean, imagine what it was like when you had to pull out the ruler and slice magnetic tape. That's what it was like before computers were around, and before computers came hand. And I think, people who have worked with digital audio and developing digital audio have really been aware of this for a really long time. I mean, even if you go back to Max Matthews' original work at the Bell Labs in the late 50s and 1960s, and the development of programs such as the Music series, Music 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and some of the later software he did, which later became the basis for C Sound, which is still in use in the 80s, which was originally developed in the 80s. These innovations are really crucial to understand how music and audio has been made for decades. And I think any practitioner in music technology in any sort of form can really benefit from engaging with these sort of contemporary music APIs. API meaning advanced programming interface. Every field of technology has its own API. And music APIs, they're commonly used these days are Max, named after Max Matthews, of course. PD, also developed by Miller Puckett, who originally developed Max MSP, now just called Max. Other ones like Super Collider or Chuck. There's a whole handful of them. These are probably the three most widely used, I think, these days. Beyond this, I think learning how to work with an API allows individuals to understand how music technologies in both the digital and the analog realm work from a fundamental level. You can see how people have been developing from these technologies from a very long time. All this said, talking, sort of waxing philosophic about the benefits of digital, I think it is kind of hard to deny some of the value of analog. There's a character that analog technologies can imbue that's just really quite lovely. I mean, for instance, when I'm at home, I have thousands of CDs. I have usually over 1,000 CDs. But I don't have a CD player, and I mostly just listen to vinyl. It sounds better. I have an electric guitar. I have multiple electric guitars, and I'm going to plug those into my tube amp way more than I'll ever plug them directly into my digital audio interface in my computer. It's just, there's one particular thing, it's like digital clipping. It's awful. It's a horrible sound, but analog, the saturation when you push the edges in analog technologies, it's beautiful. There's just this wonderful sort of harmonic colorization. It's hard to replicate. And I think there's something valuable about that I think we can lose if we become really sort of ideological and saying digital's better.
You mentioned Max MSP and how Max handled this battle between analog and digital. I mean, you're my professor, and I have been studied Max for more than 1 year, and I learned actually that Max can emulate and can allow students to build all analog synthesizer if they, of course, know the algorithms.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I mean, because I'll speak just briefly about analog technologies, because I think there is an advantage to analog technologies in that I think there's something which we can lose sight of in computers, which is the design. There is this incredible user interface which has been conceived of. When you've begun to understand how synthesizers work, and I think Max is a terrific pedagogical tool, because I think Max and any other API, I am software agnostic. I don't believe any software is necessarily any better than any other software. I think Max is good, PD is good, Super Collider is good. They're all music APIs, and you can learn very similar principles from them. I particularly teach Max just because the learning curve is not as steep as it is on a program like Super Collider, for instance, which is literally writing code, or a program like PD, which is not as well as developed and doesn't have nearly as many modular objects as a program like Max MSP does. And Max MSP is still to this day the most widely used audio and music API. So I think students, if they learn Max MSP, will have the ability to transition to many different sort of situations. But that said, when you work with something like Max, you can really understand how things were structured and built inside of analog APIs. You understand sort of the things that people were interested in, because there is this direct lineage from the original APIs of the late 1950s, late 1960s until today. And the interests that people were working on in the digital realm, the interests that people work on in the analog realm, in terms of user interface in terms of sonic exploration were very much the same. People were working, in tandem, but in different realms. So I think, an API is really useful for helping students sort of understand how an analog works, as well as understanding just what has gone into developing the digital technologies we have today. And then also, and I'll probably talk about this some later, like how we can sort of free ourselves to do what we want to creatively with technology.
That is my next question. How do you see the relationship between technology and creativity? And how do they rely on or help each other?
Yeah. As a composer and artist, I really greatly value technology. But this said, I think it's something we need to be really careful with and engage with very critically. A lot of people just broadly fall into sort of this religion of technology, and there's a lot of pitfalls with usage of technology. I think we need to really be mindful of when we use technology, what we're actually doing and what we're engaging with. So to sort of preface this, and I have a whole sort of spiel, which I've given many times, to sort of preface this, I want to paraphrase something Marshall McLuhan has often talked about, which is basically, some people when they talk about technology, they say, oh, technology is a tool. And Marshall McLuhan's response says that anybody who says technology is a tool is a fool. Technology is not a tool. Technology is an environment. And I think the way that I've long thought that, to get to my point in a moment, for me as an artist, for one to be creative, like the key is freedom. The artist needs to be as free as absolutely possible. Freedom is, in art, you're able to do whatever you want, and that's something we really need to treasure and value and support as much as possible. And I think really some of the dangers of music technologies is that they can be incredibly limiting in what they allow or push or make easier for someone to do. So a good example of this, for instance, is music notation software. Many people use music notation software to, okay, on one hand, the environment of music notation software, it's so much faster and so much easier to use than writing music with a pen and pencil. This said, when you use music notation software, there are very specific limitations and constraints on what it allows the user to do and what it allows the user to do easily and quickly. And if you're not aware of what these constraints are, you can start writing music which is the result of the constraints of the music notation software. And honestly, I mean, if you think about this sort of like awareness of what are the boxes that technology puts us in, any piece of developed technology puts us in, there always are limits. There are always things that if we're not aware of, if we're not critical of what the technology is presenting us with as an environment, we don't push against these, and we're not free as artists. We're not truly doing what we could do, and really exploring art and really exploring things, really getting to the heart of it, trying to do something really interesting, something spiritual, something deep, something that touches the humans. So, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, the more technologies I've used over the years and music technologies, I'm always amazed at how frequently I listen to music or I see an artwork and I'm like, metasynth. That piece is a metasynth beat. That is a piece constrained by that piece of software. That is a piece constrained by that plugin. That is a piece constrained by this. I mean, it's so obvious to me a lot of times when I hear a lot of music. And I think we really need to be mindful of this. We really need to be aware that technology is an environment and it provides us with, various limitations and constraints that we need to be aware that they're limiting us as artists and freedoms. This said, there's another angle to technology being an environment, which is that it can provide a whole sort of novel perspectives by which to view the world. I'll talk probably about more examples about this later and talk about my own music. But, for one thing, it can provide us with insights, with ways to view acoustics or space. It can provide us with quantitative measurements, that we don't have. Like, for instance, I obsessively study waveforms, trying to understand what I'm hearing is relationship to the quantitative measurement of volume. I obsessively look at spectrograms. I'm using this to try to help myself understand the world better. And there's so many things that you can use technology to sort of interact with and create sort of experiences or sort of experiments that allow us to have this sort of environment to explore and get deeper and to be more free, and to really move beyond the constraints of what the design was built into the software that was distributed.
What is the importance of studying sound, perception, cognition, etc.? And how does that knowledge help one create and recreate new experimental works? It's not rare to read about critical listening, so maybe you can give me your opinion on the critical listening concept.
I'll talk more about I think, there's sort of two questions here, and maybe I'll address some of the first one first, and then maybe
Sure.
we'll see if I can get to the second one. Maybe the second one is sort of implicit in what I speak about the first one. So I think, an analogy I've often made over the years, and I've made it so many times at this point that it almost begins to feel contrite, is that if you look at the history of Western classical music, it has been an expansion of resources. Initially, it was largely constrained by the voice and these instruments which had very limited tessituras. Later, those tessituras expanded, the dynamic range expanded. For instance, you think about the time of Bach, we had harpsichords, and very sort of simple, viola instruments.
Mm-hmm.
Later, the range of the orchestra increased, the piano increased through the age of through Beethoven's life, And so there's been this sort of continuous, if you look at it from a larger perspective in terms of Western music, there's been this sort of continuous expansion of dynamics, timbre, register, tessitura, and orchestration possibilities. And really the thing that's really blew this all open was when electronics, technology, recording technologies came into existence.
Mm-hmm.
Now everything is possible. Almost everything you can imagine, everything you want is possible. It's interesting to me a lot of times thinking about what people do with technology, that in essence, a lot of the theories and a lot of the basics of what people are doing with technology were developed and codified in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it's really just sort of the thing that we have now is we have the control, we have sort of information theory and sort of the ability to do things with computers that people were just dreaming of back then. This said, I think, when we're given this sort of it's like Spider-Man with great power comes great responsibility. I mean, when you have the capacity, I'm not a comic book person, but forgive me, it's a good popular analogy I think a lot of people get.
Sure.
When you can do anything, you have to think about, well, what are you going to do, and how is it going to be perceived, and how it's going to be dealt with. So I think one thing partially is kind of and at a very basic level, I think sometimes we need to consider just sort of simple, for lack of a better word, ethical considerations of sound that we create with technology. And this is where, studying sound perception and cognition is really useful. So for instance, there for many years, since World War II and since it's been developed, there was referred to as the Fletcher-Munson curves, which are now referred to as the equal loudness curve. So basically, the United States government took a bunch of soldiers during World War II and they subjected them to various sine wave frequencies at various amplitudes and asked them to say, how loud do you think it is? And so now what we know from this is that we don't hear every frequency the same. Certain frequencies we hear louder than certain other frequencies. Instruments, acoustic instruments, which have been dominant for the vast majority of humankind, they have been developed, to be sensitive to how we hear frequencies and how we hear sound. Electronic instruments have not. So, there is a large amount of electronic music which has no consideration about how, we hear frequencies from 2,000 to 4,000 hertz, way louder than we hear frequencies, from about 1,000 to 2,000, or how 10,000 hertz is really loud, even if it's the same volume as 100 hertz tone. We're going to hear that sounding way louder. I remember a computer music conference where it was a piece that was based upon feedback patterns, and it was 20 minutes of extremely loud, extremely high frequencies, and it was so but it's indicative. You can really damage your hearing. You can lose the high ends of your frequencies. And when you lose the high ends of your frequencies, they're gone forever. They're gone. You don't get them back. Sound is radiation. It's like when somebody goes into a power plant, they have this measurement of how much radiation they're receiving. Sound is just like that. You can only receive so much loud sounds before you don't have the ability to hear that loud sound. And I remember listening to 20 minutes people sitting in front of me, and they said, when they say 10,000 hertz, extremely high frequency, 10,000 hertz. And it was so I think, that's something that's we need to be mindful of, just from a purely, for lack of a better word, ethical perspective in terms of making electronic music. Beyond that, I think this opens up a whole world of exploration. frequencies. When you lose those high frequencies, they're gone forever. They're gone. You don't get them back. I mean, sound is radiation. It's like when somebody goes into a nuclear power plant, they have this measurement of how much radiation they're receiving. Sound is just like that. You can only receive so much loud sounds before you don't have the ability to hear these loud sounds. And I remember listening to some people sitting in front of me, and they said, when they say 10,000 hertz, 10,000 hertz hurts. There was a lot of 10,000 hertz thinking. So I think, that's something that's we need to be mindful of, just from a purely, I think, for lack of a better word, ethical perspective in terms of making electronic music. We need to be aware of what are we doing to our ears with some of these sounds. But beyond that, I think, this opens up a whole world of exploration. James Tenney, I think, was really he worked at the Bell Labs in the 1960s, and I think he was really sort of a pioneer in this. Amazing. He wrote his master's thesis in the late 1950s at the University of, I believe, Illinois, which was largely this combination of applying Gestalt theory, which was largely based at that time solely on perception of the visual field, because our visual cortex is dominant. Most of our neurons in our brain are dedicated to the visual cortex. He was applying the principles of what was understood about Gestalt's psychology in terms of analysis in the perception and in terms of visual field to music and the auditory field. And his whole thesis was based on what are the salient properties of what determines what carries form, what carries our perception and cognition of what is meaningful and carries music. And when he went to the Bell Labs later, he took these ideas that he had studied and he applied them to music that he could make with technology. So that, how can I, take these sort of ideas of Gestalt principles of sound to structure a material that's like no other material we've ever heard? How can I make that musically sensical? How can I make that something that's pushes the realms of what can be understood about our relationships, structuring of sound, where music is not necessarily something that is constrained to acoustic instruments more, but now constrained to nothing, constrained to everything that's at our fingertips. So I can give a lot more examples, but these, I think, are two sort of concrete examples, just, in terms of awareness of what is the sensation of sound, in the acoustic versus, the electronic realm where we can do anything, versus, what do we know about sound and what can we study about the way you understand sound and form and structure, and how can we then use that to inform what we might do when we create music when anything is possible.
Thank you for explaining the Fletcher-Manson curve and the relation between loudness and the frequency range. And in terms of higher frequency notes, I want to add that I have a hardship listening to those highest notes on violin. So when a violin player plays all those high notes, reaching all harmonics all the way up, I have a pain, and that's something that is that's not pleasing to my ears. However, when I listen to some other instruments like trumpet, for example, and when they produce those flageolets, it doesn't bother me so much. So there is not a big pain that I feel when I listen to a violin. And I want to say that the timbre is definitely the element, the parameter that plays a big role, an important role in our listening perception. It's something the same when you hear some squeaky sound when someone opens the door or when someone moves the chair. It's also something that similar to the violin that I mentioned.
Actually, here's something that's actually very interesting. You might not know this, but a lot of times people talk about the limits of human hearing. They say that typically, human hearing's limit is 20,000 hertz. That's why we have a 44.1 kilohertz as the basic standard for audio recordings. Honestly, actually, we can hear all the way up to about 100 kilohertz. We can hear way higher. But the thing is, we don't hear those really high frequencies consciously the way we hear them. We hear them often haptically. So for instance, as a simple thought experiment, just to sort of bring back an experience I'm sure you've had, nails on a chalkboard. Styrofoam, somebody taking a piece of styrofoam and cracking it in half. that produces frequencies which are way beyond 20,000 hertz. We don't hear that in our ears. What we hear that is, and we hear it in our skin. We hear that in our body. Our body is sensitive to these vibrations. We don't necessarily hear them. And that's the thing, like a lot of analog things in the analog realm, they're not constrained by the Nyquist frequency, so they get really high into that register. And same thing, sometimes with, analog synthesizers, if they're not being sampled, they go, a square wave goes way up. It can cause that same sort of sensation to you. So I think that's part of that might be something to do with that.
Yeah, of course. It's incredible how many aspects of sounds we can approach too. And I can make an analogy. I remember when Robert Bob Wilson came to Serbia to give a lecture on his experimentation with the sound. Bob Wilson, one of the greatest playwriters and theater directors and also theoreticians. He started a lecture with an image on the screen with a boy who was deaf, and he explained how he learned to perceive sound or sound vibrations over the ground. So he would play the sound behind him, and after years, the boy became a dancer, so he could dance because he felt the vibrations that traveled over the ground.
Oh, yeah.
And also, if you look at the zoo musicology, it teaches us that there are a lot of animals, a lot of sea animals like whales that can perceive and transmit high-pitched tones, like whales can produce the sound that is 20K hertz or even more. And that's how they communicate to each other.
What also, actually, a lot of whale songs, if I remember, are actually subsonic. They're below what we can hear. They're below what we hear, just like bats. Bats actually have supersonics. Bats actually sing songs, but their songs are like above human hearing range.
Right.
There's a really, I often think about this. There's a great Zen sort of parable, which which sometimes I think about this in relationship to this, because this sort of discussion about deaf people actually hearing or blind people actually seeing, which is there's a lot of scientists which supports this nowadays. There's a lot more to it than these sort of boxes that we put on things.
So about something about the critical listening from the listener's perspective. What knowledge listeners can get before jumping in the experimental music?
I think the work should reveal itself optimally. I think that the experiments, a number of composers I know who are experimental, and Cage talks about this as well in his famous essay or lecture, Experimental Music, which he presented in 1957. I don't have my books in Taiwan. He used to think that the term experimental music was one which he derided, but I think the thing that's more interesting about experimental music is that people who make experimental music most of the time have gone through the experiments themselves, and they've listened, like, what can I discover from this? What is the thing that I can hear that's new? What is revelatory? What is something that is different and interesting? And then once they've found an efficacious way of presenting this, and I think this is the case with experimental works which are effective, I think, effective or efficacious in their presentation. The experiment that the artist went through, the experiential situation that was trying to be presented or discovered should have been refined to the point that I think the listener should be able to understand it rather simply. So, Alvin Lucier's I'm Sitting in a Room is a great example of this. For instance, he says, listen, I'm sitting in a room, and I'm going to record the sound of my voice over and over again, and I'm just going to keep doing this process over and over again until you don't hear my voice. And all you hear is the sound of the resonant frequencies of the room, And then the only thing that might remain is like, rhythm, because he has
stuttering.
He has a stutter, and then the process reveals itself. You don't need to know any more than that. It's obvious. It's like minimal art, right? A lot of times people talk about minimal art, and minimal music came out of minimal art minimal art was, came first, and a lot of the minimal music, for lack of a better word. Many people resist this word.
Sure.
There's a time element to it, right? So, the idea being when you see a minimal work, the structure is it can be apparent to you rather quickly. Then it becomes experiential. You've experienced what the structure of the work is. Now, what is your relationship between the engagement of it? Your experience, the experiment is now part of the work. The time has become a component of it. In a lot of experimental music, for lack of a better word, or minimalist music, the process or what actually is happening, ideally, I think should be clear. You should have an idea what's going on. Sometimes you maybe need to say a sentence or two, a brief program note, or, in my opinion, optimally, the title should be enough. That should be enough to just say, okay, something's going on here. I kind of get an idea what it is. Okay, now I can just experience what it is. And I think for me, critical listening is weird. It's a strip. There are many ways to listen. There's many ways to listen, and I think there are many different modalities of listening, and each one of them provides their own thing. And I'm not going to get into like Michel Chion's theories or something right here, but I think there are many different ways of listening. I think one thing that's fascinating about experimental listening and experimental music is that it provides us with new modalities and new ways of trying to understand the world through sound, and the combination of sound and time, because sound is bound by time.
This is the great moment that we can make the transition to your sound laboratory and your experiments, and to see how you experimented with sound.
Sure.
There are a lot of works. Listeners can find your name everywhere. I mean, from YouTube to Bandcamp, SoundCloud. Let's start with the work Across an Ocean, Across the Land from 2011. I read the article on that piece. Let me first ask you, how many times was this piece performed live?
Gosh, it's a tricky question because it exists in multiple forms at this point in time. And this is something I do a lot as an artist or composer. Let's just say artist sometimes. Sometimes I don't know whether I think of myself as an artist or as a composer. Probably artist more so. I just tend to work with sound and technology most of the time. It exists in many different formats because I think a lot of times I develop a work and I put so much effort into this that I want to try to find different ramifications of it. And a lot of times my works exist in series and in relationships. I can talk about this some more later because it has a lot to do with the structure and the algorithms, the technologies in the work. But I think with and without video, and as part of a laptop ensemble, this piece does exist. It has a version as part of a laptop ensemble. It's been done with performers between 1 and 4 different performers at least half a dozen times, I think, at this point in time. There's also there was originally no video to the work. Later, my colleague Yasha Kolozinski added a video component, and multiple versions of it with the video have been played at various international conferences in Europe and Mexico and the United States. There's a version of it which is the full large Across an Ocean, Across the Land, which is about 30 minutes. And then because conferences and festivals often want pieces that are less than 10 or 15 minutes, I found that the first 10 minutes of this piece is actually rather effective on its own. So I've honestly submitted to quite a few conferences the original 10 minutes as a separate piece, which I call Across the Land. Beyond this, I've also collaborated regularly with a Cambodian choreographer and dancer, Che Chang Ketia. And she's used this work or parts of this work in multiple different pieces for dance for solo, and from everywhere from solo to ensemble, I believe at least 7 or 8 dancers that have been presented in Japan, Singapore, and the largest realization was a work that she called Departure, was presented in Phnom Penh at least, I want to say 3 times. So it's been done quite a few times. It hasn't been done so often recently, but it has been presented publicly in concert or various sort of settings in many different situations.
Well, let's introduce the listeners with this piece. So you used some short recordings of a pair of some Tibetan prayer symbols, right? They're called tingsha.
Yeah.
And it was some giant microphone tam-tam, right?
Yeah, there's actually, there's 4 4 sound sources in this piece. So one of them is a tingsha, which is it's a Tibetan prayer symbol. It's two metal alloys, I think mostly silver, which you strike together. They're also sort of known as antique symbols. More recently, in modern manufacture, you might be familiar with them as, I think, crotales. But previously they were used very specifically for ritualistic purposes in Tibet. In addition to that, there are two. I have 2 Tibetan singing bowls that I recorded. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, which has the world's largest gem and mineral show every year. The world's largest gathering of dealers in gem and minerals comes to Tucson every year for about 3 weeks. And we have friends, and we've been able to gather dealership things. So we'd often just go to hotels and see all the dealers. And so for many years, there were multiple dealers who would bring ancient artifacts from Tibet. And I remember just going through boxes of these ancient brass Tibetan singing bowls, which are lovely. You hit them and then you can bring the edges with them. I've been obsessed with these things for, I want to say 27 years now. And part of that, and part of the interest of that comes from there's this, I have a really strong interest in Eastern philosophy and Buddhism. There's this wonderful Tibetan prayer, or prayer might be a good way to translate it, which is referred to as a goth. And I'm just going to paraphrase it. It's only like 4 lines. But the basic idea is that if only everybody could realize that every sound in the world could be sustained infinitely, that within every moment and of every sound, there's an infinite suspension, then, everybody could reach pure enlightenment. So one wonderful thing about these bowls is you can sustain that sound. So I've been obsessed with that for forever. So those 3 sounds I've used them in so many pieces, and they comprise a large portion of this. Basically, 1 recording of me hitting the tingsha, and I think like 3 or 4 of me just banging the other 2 Tibetan singing bowls. And then the other one, there are a number of series of recordings of what's often referred to as the microphony tam-tam. It's just shy of 2 meters in diameter, famously used by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen for his pieces Microphony 1 and 2, I think also with Mixture and other pieces. And when I was at the University of California, San Diego, doing my doctorate, they actually purchased this tam-tam for $50,000. Who knows how much it's worth? It's worth a lot. So I actually spent one entire, I was friends with a lot of percussionists, and I actually spent an entire afternoon placing microphones just like 2 or 3 inches from the tam-tam and sitting with one of my percussionist friends while he was in this recording studio and I was in the sound booth saying, okay, hit it this way. So I have like 6 hours of all these really close microphones doing all sorts of crazy things on this tam-tam. So yeah, just those basic simple attacks of the Tibetan instruments, and then these various sorts of things we explored that I honestly really chose rather quickly from this extensive 6-hour recording session that I really haven't mined to its full potential yet. The samples in this piece, the way they change, the way I manipulate them is rather simple. Besides various changes in dynamics, basically I change their pitches by changing their speed. So I don't use phase vocoders or anything like that. It's just it's classic old school tape technology where if I want something to be an octave lower, I slow it down half. So or if I want it to be 2 octaves lower, I slow it down by a quarter. So it's really pretty, to some extent, primitive in what it is, but I really like these kind of constraints. And to some extent, I'm probably jumping the gun because we're going to talk about spectral analysis, but I find for my ears when I was creating this piece, and generally when I do this kind of approach, I find that slowing down sounds better than speeding up sounds. And you can get into the sound more when you stretch it out. You can really kind of hear it much more. I think, a good analogy would be sort of the visual experimental cinema of Maya Deren. Maya Deren was very fond of slowing down cinema, slowing down films. Her films are full of slower motion to allow you to really see the motion. Or another example, to speak of audio, the classic work by Brian Eno, Music for Airports, which is largely just loops, asynchronous loops. But one of the small and subtle things that often gets, I think, neglected when people talk about that piece is he slowed down the recordings just a bit, so you can hear just a little bit more of the texture. So that was something I found really fascinating, was just taking these recordings, which are extremely rich, and then just what happens when I slow them down to very, 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 very slow. There's some fascinating things I found. Sorry, I just interrupted. I found that some of the sounds on the tam-tam, for instance, some of the frictive sounds, not percussive sounds, frictive sounds, which are made with like bows or various things that my percussionist wouldn't tell me what he was doing. I have hints, I have ideas. But when I slowed them down, they started to actually sound like humans. They started to have like, sort of utterances. And there's something also just, I think it's hard to deny the vibratory quality of acoustic sound, of electronic sound, the force of a low frequency at a high volume. It's physical, it's embodied sound, and I think there's something that's really important and valuable about that, which is often overlooked.
And the speaker should be placed around the audience, like and near the four corners of the performer's space. Explain to me the effect the audience can feel with that quadraphonic loudspeaker setup.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very much fascinated by surround sound. I think most of my works have a surround sound component to them. Typically, I'm very practical about things. I'm not so dogmatic. I mean, like if there's only stereo, I'm not going to say, hey, you at home, you only have headphones, you can't listen to my music because it's surround sound. No. I try to find ways around that. But I think that like with surround sound, it's something that there's something almost primal to the listening of surround sound that I think is really absolutely fascinating that I try to explore in a lot of my works. Give you an early example of this. Was one of my earliest examples. I mean, I did write a piece for surround sound when I was an undergrad, just because I was like, I wanted to expand the range of the piano, and I was doing a piece for piano electronics. So I wrote a piece in surround sound for piano electronics, which the school I was at, it had been the first time somebody had done surround sound. But I was just like, I want to expand piano in all its ways, and this electronics is the way to do that. But I remember like when I really started to get serious, I did all the programming, and then they masked the tape, and then I only heard it in concerts. I didn't really actually get to work with it and study. It was just all conjectural. But I remember when I did my master's at McGill, when we were first looking at various sorts of techniques for surround sound, the teacher, my teacher at the time, Sean Ferguson, his demo was to take the sound of a dog growling. And we were inside the surround sound space of 6 speakers, and then move the virtual location of it, the dog growling around us, and when it's in front of you, it's kind of like, okay. But then when it gets behind you, it's like, fight or flight, it's something primal happens when there's a sound behind you. Our ears are very, very, and this gets back to the whole perception cognition thing. If we're not aware of this, of the ramifications of this, you can't really take advantage of this when you create with these sort of tools. Our ears are very, very, very sensitive to about 120 degrees of the central focus. We have incredible resolution for that. Beyond that, our resolution is really bad. And so I think, that this is just demonstrative of the fact that, when something's behind here, we can't really tell where it is. So we resort to sort of like, is it scary? Or is it okay? And I think that's something that surround sound allows for us, because we are used to hearing environments which are all around us. And for some reason or another, in Western classical music, we've gotten into the pattern of just hearing music right in front of us, straight in front, focally. So I think bringing back that experience of listening is really important to me in terms of using surround sound. Purely practical perspective, it's in 4 channels just because it's the easiest one to set up. I moved to Miami when I had just moved to Miami when I wrote this piece, and I was doing a lot of performances outside the university. Before then, University of California, San Diego, and McGill, where I did my master's or my doctorate and master's respectively. We had really good setups where we could do 6, 8, and up to 32 channel speaker setups, or no, 64 channel speaker setups. Anything was possible, right? So you could really get into resolution and things like this, and try to really get into this physics and the engineering of surround sound. But when I came to Miami, it's like, we're going to do this in an art gallery in Wynwood, and I got to schlep these speakers myself in a borrowed car. So it was like, okay, let's just do it in quad. Quad gets me that resolution I usually do surround sound. So that's why it's in quad. Hearing my music in surround sound is a vastly different experience from hearing in stereo. I do as best I can to make it practical in headphones, but you do lose something. I really believe you lose something when you hear it in stereo. There's also some diffusion algorithms that are at play, and they deal a lot with the algorithms that are relationship to the frequencies of the work. or the sort of frequency transformations that I do on the samples in the work. It's basically there's some algorithms which are correlative to the algorithms of the frequency changing, which are basically I attempt to do something very similar in the surround sound realm to a Shepard tone, statistical Shepard tone that I do within the frequency realm as well. So
Okay.
and it's something it works so much better. And there's also just this sort of like Brownian cloud thing where I'm trying to transform algorithms of cloud motion into some of the samples that move. That it's just it works really. It sounds really nice in surround sound.
So you're talking about the Shepard tone in this piece.
Yeah, there's something that I've been I have this sort I've played with sort of things that are inspired by or analogous to this Shepard tone in a number of my works, which is this very sort of interesting aural illusion that was discovered by, it's debated who discovered it. It's attributed largely to Roger Shepard, who the famous experimental psychologist who worked at the Bell Labs, notably in the 60s. But there are rumors that it was actually invented by Jean-Claude Rizier or possibly Jim Tenney, actually.
Let's speak about spectral analysis you did before composing the piece. It seems like a different approach than we may find in Gerard Griset analysis of all instruments in his, let's say, partials, isn't it? It's different approach, right?
Yeah. The piece partial is the piece partial is like the first few minutes of partial, and the piece which precedes it in Les Espaces Acoustiques, which is Griset's large 2-hour exploration of acoustic sound through various forms of instruments and combinations of instruments. What's the piece? Periods is the piece that came before it. Periods ends with the ensemble presenting a performance of the analysis of a low E on a bass trombone, and then the first few minutes of partial also take advantage of this. This is what's referred to. The technique is often referred to as instrumental synthesis. The idea being that you when you analyze a sound spectrally, sound is made up of various frequencies, sine waves, with various different amplitudes and different phase. So the idea then in instrumental synthesis is to take these simple sinusoidal components and instead apply them to instruments. So you create this sort of hallucinogenic thing, which is neither quite timbre and not quite harmony either. My friend Ken Ueno, who's a terrific composer as well, often likens this technique to bundt cake. Where, I don't know if you know bundt cake. It's like it's like this cake which has the shape, and then you throw in the goo. And the shape of the bundt cake is the spectral analysis. And instead of throwing in sine waves, which are like water or ice, you throw in like fruitcake batter. My grandmother made the greatest fruitcake. Fruitcake gets a bad rap in America, but you throw in something which is more interesting. So it has some characteristics of that original thing. So it doesn't quite resemble harmony, but it doesn't quite resemble timbre either. It's something much more complicated. Griset has used a lot of techniques, later in his life. Fourth piece in L'Espace Acoustique deals a lot with distortion synthesis, so transcriptions of ring modulation, frequency modulation. Transitois, one of the last pieces in the cycle, deals with transcriptions of transitois in French, the sort of the noisy components that happen after you hit like a percussive instrument. Later he dealt with the harmonic series specifically, and then later he became, in pieces such as Talea, later he became rather disillusioned even with that and started moving with sort of just compressed and contracted harmonic series and the harmonic series itself, just to create this vast reservoir of material which you could draw from. And I think, you compare this with works like Mirai. Mirai's done extensive use of the instrumental synthesis, as well as, in a piece like Gondwana, using transcriptions of FM synthesis. Lamont Young, has been obsessed with very intricate usages of the harmonic series, largely inspired by studies of classical Indian music. His guru lived upstairs from, I believe, almost 40 years, and classical Indian music makes extensive usage of the harmonic series. And this goes back to the sort of the mysticism of Pythagoras in terms of the relationship between ratio, number, and sound. Alvin Lucier, who deals with sort of the revelation of sound and acoustics, and various sort of pieces or vibratory patterns in terms of works like still moving lines and families of hyperbolas. But all this said, I think, in terms of spectral works, the thing that's really sort of a strain which continues throughout all these, outside of just these techniques, which are just, they're techniques, is this concern with using an emphasis on frequency itself, rather than this abstract notion of pitch, which is often decorrelated from timbre, in terms of a lot of music, which I think is honestly a horrific mistake of many composers of the mid 20th century and later up until now. This emphasis on frequency is a interesting and crucial thing to consider in terms of structuring a work. So there's a long way to get to the answer what I deal with in terms of analysis in this piece, but so in this piece, basically, I did a basic spectral analysis of my Tibetan bells, of the big bell, the big bowl, the small bowl, and the tingsha. And it's classic instrumental synthesis to some extent, except I'm using these samples. So what I did is I took the loudest frequency and I treated that as the quote unquote fundamental of each of those. The tingsha has a very clear E. It's pitched E. Anybody will assume it's an E. All the other the two bells you would disagree with. But I treat that as the fundamental, and I make the fundamental. Oh God, what do I do? I set that into this. I use that as a way to create the ratios by which I transpose to fit the bell. So the bell is transposed to the relation to the various interval frequential relationships of the bell itself. So it's like listening to the bell of the bell. The tingsha is transposed to the various frequential relationships of the analysis of the bells. I have various ways I combine all these analysis. And I think, and this does not consider the fact that every frequency in a sound is quieter or louder. I treat them equally. And I often think about this in terms of like a visual correlative, which is like saturation. When you take a photo and you saturate it, so every color is just that much more vibrant.
Sure.
So it's like a way of like sort of like, it's the bell of the bell, except like super saturated bell of bell,
Tell me something about the formal attributes and algorithmic processes you used in this piece.
There is a set of algorithms which I've used in many of my pieces, which this piece explores in a very particular manner. I've often referred to it as the cloud algorithm. And the cloud algorithm, I can explain it rather briefly. So I'll explain, for instance, rhythm. Rhythm is a component. So one of the aspects is rhythm. So in the cloud algorithm, notes occur at a rather regular interval in relationship to each other, and then they have little pauses in between them in order to create the perception of musical phrases. And this is designed to sort of resemble linguistics and the way we communicate in language. For instance, I am speaking to you a set of words at a rather steady tempo, and then when I'm ready to pause that tempo and say that this is the end of the sentence, I pause. And then I continue speaking at that tempo. A smaller break emphasizes a comma. A larger break emphasizes that I am concluded and that there is a sentence completion. It's a very linguistic analysis for the sort of for the Gestalt idea of proximity. When things are proximate, we group them into phrases. We group them into units. So the rhythm is set up in this way. There's this basic rhythm which is established. You can speed it up or slow it down. There's a slight jitter, so slight randomness to it because, if I make it too normal, it's going to sound like a machine, and I don't like things to sound too much like machines. I'm trying to imitate nature here. And then, there's this probability of interruption.
Right.
So it'll create phrases. The algorithm is designed to very simply and very rudimentarily imitate the linguistic patterns of language and the way in which we parse information at the most rudimentary level. So that's the rhythm. There's a simple dynamic, which is basically, it's a range of dynamics, and there's a random little jittering of it, and I can make the range wider or lower. It's just because it's dynamics. I just kind of want, as things get louder, they get faster, so they correlate, so they're coupled. So you can there's a very clear connection between them. So you don't necessarily hear this decoupling, which allows for a decorrelation of the information. We can only process so much information at a time. Beyond this, there is sort of a registral constraint. So the idea is this register can be everywhere from one note to the entire tessitura of interval ratios, which are afforded by the analyses, which I did. So I specify the range in which these sounds occur. Within that, each sample, and this is where the cloud component comes into play, each sample is either randomly chosen from within that register, or it is the succeeding lower sound. The idea being this is like kind of like barometric pressure and clouds. It's a really rough, dirty algorithm. It's kind of stupid simple. It's like, between each note, it's like either randomly choose or 50% of the time choose a little bit lower. And when the barometric pressure is right, I don't know much about meteorological science. Barometric pressure is lowering. Is that making rain? Whatever. Whenever it's more likely to rain, things go down, right? So there's more probability of them going down. And when there's less probability of them going down, it's just random. So it's like more like a cloud. So it's like when it's more like a cloud, things are randomly within the register. And then when things are continuing to go down, they're going down more often. This is something, that there's a couple reasons why. So this leads itself to gradual transformation, extremely gradual transformation. I can gradually speed up, I gradually increase the volume, and I gradually move from random to descending lines and then back up. The descending lines are kind of like these like constantly random. It's like a barber's pole, like the shepherd tone, which is this constantly revolving thing which moves down, except it's random. It's like this randomly constantly. It's like, oh, it keeps falling down. I do the exact same thing with spatialization, where it's constantly moving randomly or clockwise or counterclockwise. So it's constantly like, doing this or, just, randomly sorting. So there's a very clear correlative between the pitch shepherd tone, statistical pressure tone, and the spatialization positioning. So why did I do this? It's kind of poetic. Like there's a couple of things very much inspired by nature. Two examples I think of really I always remember was when you probably live in cold climates. We live in Miami now, but I remember living in Montreal. Like when winter is the edge of winter or the edge of spring. When you watch rain, and then gradually it slows down and it turns into snow, which is slow and random and drilled, and then gradually speeds up and it turns back into rain. I remember I would in that time of year, I would just stand outside and just marvel at these transitions. Or like watching, when I live in San Diego, watching the clouds of fog come off the ocean. You see it coming, you can see there's this tendency for something to happen, and then it's just there. And beyond that also, I think, it has a lot to do with, this is a sort of a spiritual concept in terms of like, Buddhism often talks about the idea of, we don't have a state. We don't have a way in which we exist. We're just this constant movement between things, and so being that there isn't this finalized state, that things are always transitioning from one state of things, from one set of patterns to another set of patterns, I think is a really sort of nice sort of correlative to that. So that has been largely the inspiration for that algorithm. I've used it in a lot of pieces. In this specific piece, it's all generated by the computer. The various parameters like range, speed, jitter, et cetera, those are controlled by performers, and they can sort of control it faster or slower based upon they trying to aim for this like smoothest as possible aesthetic. But yeah, the other pieces, sometimes I have the performer do it as well as the computer simultaneously. So there's this friction between the computer and the performer trying to realize the same sort of information. There's many different ways I play with it over the years. It's been very fruitful.
I like that vivid description of rain and snow. And I was thinking of the video when you mentioned that video starts with a slow motion that Jacek Kovačević did. So let's just quickly touch upon that. Tell me more about the collaboration between you and Jacek, and how much is the collaboration between sound and visual art? It's crucial for experimental arts.
Jacek is my colleague in visual arts. And we've both admired each other's works for quite a while. And we spoke about collaborating. And at one point in our life, I think I just was like, hey, we were talking about like things that he could add video to, because this is a modality of collaboration which he has done quite a few times, particularly with my colleague Orlando Garcia. I was like saying, hey, I got this electronic piece, and I maybe you might have some ideas with this video. So, okay. Even before he heard it, he's like, maybe I'll do something with clouds and my balcony and Coral Gables. And he listened to it and he's like, oh, I got this video, The Great Wall. We have to use this video. Like, this video is like, this is perfect. So, my colleague Orlando Garcia and I used to do concerts where we would project on the wall of the Frost Art Museum. And so we would do like sort of intermedia video concerts. And so we decided to put this concert on there, put that piece on that concert. And so I think we had like 3 days. And so we sat down in his office and he's like, okay, we were listening to the piece and he showed me all the videos. Okay, that video goes first. That video should go second. Maybe that one second or third. And then he was just like, okay, randomly slow them down, randomly overlap them. So I did some algorithmic stuff where I was just like, okay, randomly overlap here, randomly slow down this much, And so there is a video version. There is a version of this where if we perform it, there's actually a video operator which actually clicks various buttons and controls a sort of random slowing down, random transitioning that sort of has somewhat of a correlation to what's going on in the video. The thing about it is, it just provides a different context. I think, the slowing down in the video, the piece is very similar to the slowing down of the audio. It's a very similar correlative process. I mentioned the work of Maya Deren. It's a very similar sort of thing where if you slow it down, you see certain levels of texture, certain levels of detail which you weren't able to understand beforehand. I think also just to speak some about collaboration between different media in experimental work. I think there's a lot of importance in sort of this idea of doing cross-modal or multimodal work in contemporary work. If you go back to one of the classic works, Duchamp's, Fountain, the toilet, which apparently was not, there's a lot of evidence that actually wasn't made by Duchamp. It opens up, it could be any art, can be anything, Similarly, Cage, with Silence in 433 says, we don't even need to include performance into his sound. Cage in the summation of his essay on experimental music says, well, where do we go from here? Theater. We combine things. I think this sort of cross modality, the experimentalism, it leads to cross and multimodality where we're no longer constrained by these strictures of media. And I think honestly, if you look back, we haven't talked too much about culture, but I think culture is really something that's really important to me. If you look into classical culture, if you look beyond just classical art and whatnot, I think it's a very big misconception, this idea that there's classical music. No, there's classical musics. What you call classical music is the white male, largely colonial music of Western Europe. There's all these tremendous cultures that are deep and vibrant and rich from throughout the world. And if you look at a lot of these, they don't necessarily bind themselves to the media in the ways that Western classical culture has. Music as music, visual art as visual art. Dance is dance. I mean, if you look, for instance, I've worked a lot with Cambodian dancers, for instance. In Cambodian music, in Cambodian traditional art, there's not music or dance. There's music dance. It's the same thing. Music is not without dance. Dance is not without music. You don't separate them. They work together. There are many, many places of this throughout the world, where the media are crossed. They're combined. They're very much merged. And I think, to some extent, I think some people have lost ways, just saying we work only in music, we work only in audio, we work only in video. I think the ability to cross and combine media, to work across media, or to not even necessarily be bound by a specific type of media is, I think, really something that's crucial to the artist being free, as I mentioned beforehand. And I think that's really much a part of experimental work and experimental music.
If we compare, for example, across an ocean, across the land with other pieces such as stone bells and long reeds spinning in the wind, or, for example, threads of wind for saxophone, quartet, and electronics. The piece Stone Bells and Long Reeds Spinning in the Wind is for piano. How the approach to spectral analysis differs between them?
Okay, yeah. So to speak about the various techniques, spectral analysis techniques that are in these works. I mean, recently, and particularly in a piece, I think threads unraveling, for a large extent, as well as Stone Bells. Something I've been interested in doing a lot recently is actually just transcription. In a piece like Across an Ocean, Across the Land, I'm very much, as I mentioned, there's this sort of saturated abstraction of the information, of spectral analysis information. Whereas in pieces like Threads of Wind, I use the same analyses of the Tibetan bells, and I also include the Tibetan bells in the electronics, but I also include the relationships and dynamics between the various partials. I actually maintain those. I've been interested in, when doing this, in this sort of the negative space that comes when you create a translation of material. This sort of this aura of something that was there that's no longer there. I think there's similar works of something sort of correlative as the works of Peter Abelinger recently. Peter Abelinger is very much obsessed with the idea of translation. He has works, famously the works for voices and piano, where he uses analyses of various people's speeches and has those speeches being spoken at the same time as a piano playing various sorts of analyses, or the piece where a player piano plays a spectral analysis of Schoenberg complaining about a recording of one of his works, for instance, or, pieces where, for instance, percussion plays the sound of rain, or a pianist plays the sound of static on a vinyl record that's playing with it at the same time. Those are very direct correlatives. And I think, this sort of idea of information and transcription, what does transcription mean, and how do we gather information from things, is something which really gets brought out in Ablinger's work. But from something that I find that very interesting is sort of the absence, or the sort of the aura. So, for instance, in a piece like Stone Bells, you don't hear the stone bells, but you hear the relationships quantized to 12-tone equal temperament instead of the actual frequencies which they are. And and very similar approximations of the intervallic, or the dynamic intervals between the various partials as realized by pianists, as from a transcription, we just bang in at one time. So, I mean, you get this aura, you can get this sort of tacit sense of the thing itself without actually hearing it. And I think, the other part in that piece in Stone Bells is I do transcriptions, and sort of these rough transcriptions of the sounds of these reeds themselves, spinning with these kites, Cambodian kites, that I recorded in Cambodia for my mentor, the preeminent Cambodian American composer Chineri Ung, who had been dreaming of recording these since the late 60s. And I in the process, I was trying to gather the spirit, but also sort of what's missing from the sound when you transcribe it, when you do this. And for me, that's just something, this sort of negative space is just something that I found interesting in the work like that. In a piece like, Threads of Wind, the relationship between that kind of negative space and the actual sound itself is intriguing, because a lot of times I find that the performers will actually, and I've done this in other pieces too, or some similar things in other pieces with instrumental synthesis and electronics before, the performers will actually tune to the actual sounds. You actually get something which becomes much more that hybrid. And it's almost like the relationship between, for instance, you have an actor and you have a film, and the film subsumes the actor. So suddenly the actor's in this film, or suddenly the film becomes real and is part of the actor's life itself. So it's something just I find it can be really compelling musically and engaging. So it's something I've tried to play with in many different ways throughout the years.
And before we hear this piece, Stone Bells and Long Reeds Spinning in the Wind, just to ask you, is it composed for the well-tempered piano?
Yeah, it's just a normal piano.
So you practically transposed the sound of the instrument, that klangek. What is actually klangek?
Oh gosh, yeah, I'm trying. Oh gosh, no, there's the klangek is the long. The Cambodian traditional Khmer kites are really long. They're like 7-8 feet, and they have this on them they have this like blade, which is this long reed, which is connected with string, and it spins, and it creates these really strange timbres and melodies when it flies and when it's in the wind. And I made recordings where I actually put a wireless mic on the kite as it flied. Apparently, some of the Cambodians were telling me that the sound of the kite is what the gods hear, the Cambodian gods hear. So it's like I actually captured what the gods are hearing in Cambodian folklore. I also had the director of the National Kite Museum actually took one of those blades and connected it to a string and performed it by spinning it around. And I actually spent some time directing him as I did recordings of those. So those were what comprised the materials that I used while transcribing. I also, there's also a certain amount of, just orchestration and just, creative energy in there. That sometimes I'm doing something which I'm writing material which actually resembles the behavior of the kites. It's not literally transcribed from it. There is material which is to some extent indistinguishable from what was recording, transcription, and what I just did in the behavior or the pattern of the behavior.
Let's move on to Vanish into the Clouds.
Yeah.
That is the piece for cello and live electronics. Some of your projects and compositions stand out because they're based on the neuroscience of music and cognitive processes driven by music. I'm talking about the performance installation with the cellist Jason Calloway and the project for cello with brainwave controlled electronics, transduced metal percussion and live electronics. So the name of this piece is Vanished into the Clouds for cello and live electronics. Tell me more about this piece. Tell me, how did you get into the neuroscience of music and what was the result of that project?
As I mentioned with across the land and or across the ocean, across the land previously, a lot of my works exist in different formats and different modalities. And the same can be said actually about Vanishing into the Clouds. Vanishing into the Clouds was originally just a piece for solo, cello, and electronics with no amount of neural feedback as part of it. It was part of actually, it was a piece that, it was a really hard piece to write, actually. It was one of the first times in many years that I actually consciously made a structural break. Like for me, there was a period of about 4 or 5 years when I had tried to write music which was constantly transitional without structural breaks. And when I was writing this piece, it's like, all right, it's enough of that. I need to just do solid structural breaks. And a lot of my reason for that was just that, I discovered a lot, experimented with just consistent changes in music, but I wanted to see there's a certain drama that comes with the sudden dramatic break. I mean, I'm very much a fan of literature and very much a fan of reading. My father was an English professor, and the house that I grew up in as a child, every single room had 4 to 5 bookcases full of books. So it's just, I read a novel a week on average. So literature is very important to me. It means a lot. It's how we understand the human nature. One of the best ways to understand human nature. It adds to our life experience. So, and so much of the thing when I look at literature is the fact that there are structural breaks. That is very much the key to literature. There are these things change. So when I was thinking about wanting to do this, I was thinking about a book that I had read a number of years prior called Tale of the Genji, which is a Japanese novel by Lady Murasaki. It's often quoted as the first novel. It's just over 1,000 years old, I think. It's very long. It's like 1,500 pages. There's a chapter in there which is called Vanishing into the Clouds. And Vanishing into the Clouds, it's notable because it doesn't exist. There are 2 theories, one of which is that it's lost.
Mm-hmm.
The other which is that it's an expression of the writer's sorrow, because Genji is, the eponymous character of the novel. Before Vanishing in the Clouds, he's alive. After Vanishing in the Clouds, he's dead. So one idea is the fact that, it's blank on purpose. So that it was written and it was left empty because the author could not write it, because it's just, it vanished into the clouds. He's gone. So, I mean, I was like, oh, this is fascinating. It's such a fascinating idea over 1,000 years ago, a chapter that does not exist on purpose. It's how modern can you get? And, and the later chapters in the book, which are often referred to as the Uji chapters, are just incredibly psychological. They could have been written in the 21st century. They're fascinating. So it was something, the idea of trying to use or be inspired by this book to write music was something that just kind of struck out to me. I have a cycle of 4 pieces for solo string instruments and live electronics. This is the first in there, and the last 3 are all deal with the Uji chapters, which followed this. So, unlike the chapter, it's not blank. It was just sort of an evocative thing. I was also very much interested. I was writing this, sort of, I think, largely in the tail end of the Occupy Wall Street movement in America. It was, it's a time where I think, there's a lot of awareness, and something I've been aware of for quite some time, of wealth inequality in the world, and so this idea of a musical poverty was something that interested me. So I was very much interested in this idea of trying a music which is impoverished, for lack of a better word. It doesn't rely upon traditional melody, doesn't rely upon traditional harmony. It's just, the cellist plays a single string for, I think, 2 minutes straight, So it was trying to combine these ideas. And so that was the original influences for the piece. And there's a passage where I used the cloud algorithm. I just I used it to produce melodies these sort of lilting melodies. And then to make this extreme rupture, the rate of the speed goes from about one note every, I want to say 600 milliseconds to one note every 8 seconds. It's just this suddenly it's this sudden rupture. So there's a rather extreme dynamic change, or a rhythmic change that I thought was just be really dramatic and really interesting. It later became part of, it exists as its work, it exists as part of this larger cycle. And later, I've been working, for many years, I worked on this set of projects. I've been working on sort of open set of projects, which I call spaces I listen to from within. The idea being that I'm very much interested in the relationship between spaces in the most abstract sense in which we can understand things, be they psychological, be they acoustic, be they resonant, just the basic resonance between spaces in which we exist. And I've always been fascinated by the brain, perception, and cognition, and various things like this. And I remember going to the International Computer Music Conference in 2015 and seeing that. I remember going to a poster session, and there was this guy who was showing these works with the interaxon Muse, which is a consumer-priced medical-grade EEG. It's ostensibly sold for meditation purposes, but it had a terrific SDK, sound developer kit, or kit for for development of various tools. And he was talking about it. And it's just afterwards, it's I've been in love with the idea of the way we engage with sound, and And I'd thought for a long time also about writing a piece using haptic response. Alvin Lucy has a great piece called haptic response is a way in which we can measure emotional response. Classically it's the lie detector, which has largely been discredited in terms of telling lies, but it's a way in which we can measure arousal, by the electrical conductivity, insight between various points in our skin. Alvin Lucy has a great piece where you use haptic skin response to control the speed of a clock. He also has an installation where you use haptic skin response on a plant. The plant controls the speed of a clock. So I've been very much interested in how I could do this for a long time, and particularly the idea of having a performer go through the process. Actually, what happens if, with extremely contrasting music, if we could observe really how the performer's mental activity is engaging with the music and presented. So I bought one, and I developed this large piece, which is it's a concert length. It's about anywhere between 60 to 80 or 90 minutes, depending upon how the performer plays it, with various sort of modular works that map sound data from the Muse interaxon to various parameters in a way which I try to make sonically interesting, but also to some extent revelatory to both the audience and the performer, so that they can actually engage with so the performer can engage with biofeedback, and the audience can be sort of aware of how the performer is actually engaging with himself and his own awareness and of the music itself.
You used a similar concept in the composition, a few tones for Pauline Oliveros, right?
Yeah, that's the fourth piece in the large concert work. There's 4 components. One of which is an installation component, which is just for the most of the work, I refer to them as interludes. It's the performer just sitting, and there are these tones which correlate to basically the things I'm measuring are what are referred to as interoception. Interoception is the idea that our brain is constantly monitoring our body and monitoring our brain. It's sort of low-level cognition or neurosciences. So, and among these 2 interoception parameters, one of which is concentration, how much we concentrate. So I get a data from 0 to 1. I believe it's roughly correlated to gamma waves, which are frequencies, don't quote me on this, I think between 12 and 15 hertz, I'm forgetting off the top of my head. And then alpha waves, which are roughly between 8 and 12, correspond to calmness. So I get these measurements of both calmness and concentration. So if he concentrates roughly in the interludes, you hear sounds, you hear these tones. And if he doesn't concentrate, you don't hear anything at first. And then if he's calm, these tones pulsate. If he's not calm, they pulsate very quickly. If he's calm, they pulsate very slowly. And the other thing is, whenever the performer blinks, there's a bell. Just because.
Oh, the real bell.
It's my Tibetan bells tuned at the same frequency ratios as in the previous piece we just spoke, because
So the audience can hear like 2 sounds. One is from acoustic originally the instruments cello provides, and the second is generated by the electronics, by the computer, right?
Yeah, you can hear that. And there's also live processing of the cello itself. In pieces such as in the first three pieces, Vanishing Crowds is the first, and there's two others. The interludes do not sound for the majority of the piece. They overlap to this sort of silent passage in between where he just basically meditates and focuses on his sound. But on the last piece, a few tones, the interlude lasts for the entire work. And there's also this component of what I call like concentration achievements. So if he hears, or if he concentrates for a long enough time, a new tone comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So, and these tones progressively lower through a set of sequences that I pre-composed because I just thought they sounded cool. And so it's sort of like a way that he can be aware that, oh, yeah, I'm getting better at this, or I'm sustaining this. And you can sort of, I often think about, I remember reading the Bhagavad Gita, I want to say like 20 years ago, and there was an idea in there that I really loved, which is like when your karma increases, when you do well and you climb up the spiritual ladder, you never go down. You just keep going up, you know? And so I like that idea of like, you know, you've concentrated, you've done this, it's an achievement. So there's this progression through the tones. I think there's 11 of them, if I remember correctly, which all correspond to harmonics of the C string. The entire piece actually has relationships to the harmonic series and distortions of the harmonic series of the low C string of a cello.
The last segment of this conversation, I think we should dedicate to your ensemble, Misty Shore Duo.
Oh, yeah.
You were very productive, you and your wife, during the pandemic. There are 7 albums on Bandcamp. There was a series of concerts live streamed from your apartment.
We did 8 concerts live stream from our. Yeah.
It's a great base of contemporary music from Schomburg through Alvin Lucier, your music, Toru Takemitsu, Orlando Garcia. So it's a great base.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
You call them apartment albums, and all of them are available on Mr. Shore Duo band page. So share some of the exciting moments and details from, let's say, from your apartment or from that time.
When the pandemic started, I had an inkling that this was going to last a long time, and here we are, like over a year later, and I'm in Taiwan, I'm still shut down, and in American cases are rising. So I was just like, we gotta find a way to connect with each other, and do music, 'cause even though we're not really going to be able to do concerts. So I think it was within a week of things shutting down in America. One of the first orders I made online was an Ethernet cable. We have Google Fiber in our building, so I was like, we're doing concerts. We're gonna find a way to live stream concerts, and we're just gonna do it. So that was something like early on. I didn't get started until after the semester ended. I think we didn't really start to get full hard. I didn't really start to have the time until May. Thankfully at FIU things closed rather early. So the idea was just we want to present music. We want to have the ability to do concerts and try to get the best possible audio to present music that we find interesting and compelling, into people's audiences and in people's homes, so that we can have some sort of connection, since we can't see each other in person and we can't do this in person. So that was really the large impetus to it initially. The other thing was the fact that we had often talked about the idea of just, in pop music, there's the bedroom recordings, right? People do, there are all these artists that, they do the recordings in their bedrooms, and, it's charming. There's something, wonderfully intimate about it, and I was just like, why don't we live in an apartment? Classical music is such this exalted thing. Why don't we just do it in our apartment? I got really good mics. We got a nice piano. I could do my absolute best to make the sound as good as it would in a studio. So it's like, if we're going to do these recordings, you're going to prepare these Genway. If you're going to prepare all these concerts, and I'm going to prepare all the tech and stuff, why don't we just record it right after we prepare it, and just put it up so we can do that. We were originally going to do them every week, but we did the first one, I was just like, there's no way we're doing this every week. So we did every other week, and we did a lot of them through the summer. We did 7. I think we did 7 through the summer, last summer, every 2 weeks, where we had this large Google Doc with all these works that she had played beforehand, pieces that I thought we should do, pieces she thought we should do. And then we would record them afterwards and do albums. There's one concert we didn't record, which was James Romig's Still, which is a concert-length piece, largely because his wife had played it. There was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and we didn't feel like we should make another album to compete with the income that would be coming from his wife for having this whole recording out there. But the rest of it, we did record every other album, an album of every other concert. I mean, we stopped in August because 2 reasons. One, we were burned out. It was a lot of work. And the last one, I remember there was a thunderstorm that happened during the concert, and the internet got screwed up. And it's funny. I remember when I was a kid, we would go and unplug our computers whenever there was a thunderstorm. And nowadays, here I'm live streaming a concert during a thunderstorm. Oh yeah, who knew the internet would go out? Oh yeah, that's obvious. It should have gone. So that was very frustrating, I remember. And another thing also, I just have to admit, is it's lovely one thing that's nice about live streams is you can actually see audience members there as you're doing it, and that you're actually connecting with people. But I missed connecting with people, so much. I was hearing the music myself in person, but I found that I couldn't listen to other people's live streams. I couldn't listen. I didn't care. I was just like, this is not going to sound as good as it does in person. I don't want that. That's what means the most to me. That's what's magical.
We have come to the end of today's show. You have been listening to the conversation with the composer, performer, and associate professor at FIU, Jacob Sudol. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Pedja. It's been a real pleasure.
I'm sure my listeners enjoyed this conversation and got a much broader sense of the possibilities of new technologies in creating experimental music, what the music technology and composition department at FIU offers to students, and finally to familiarize with your work. For more information about your works and different streaming channels, check all links in the description. To find more about Soundologia, to hear more about our guests and listen to our previous shows, please visit us at soundologia.com. Our next guest is Jose Veliz, a Miami-based composer, performer, and educator. I'm your host, Pedja Kovačević, and if you have any comments or recommendations, do not hesitate to write to us.